Before I begin, I want to assure everyone that I am not a special person. Now, I say that because you're going to hear some things that might sound amazing to you, but I assure you, I have no special genetics. I have no special intelligence. I have nothing that's special from all of you, except perhaps a special attitude. The only thing that could be considered special about me is an attitude, and that is it. And an attitude in all of us can be changed and trained, which I'm about to talk about. Changing our attitudes, as I said, is a matter of training. So I'd like to share some of the lessons that I've learned from my athletic pursuits, from my mental pursuits, and from my stroke and injuries that I've endured over the course of my life. Much of what I'm going to say has been uncovered by neuroscientists over the past 20 years. So if anything I'm saying is new to you, you're forgiven because not a lot of this stuff is in public information just yet. So many years ago, I suffered very many bodily injuries. I'm a very adventurous individual, and having accidents was part of the routine. But I wondered, from one head injury that I had suffered in 2004, I was wondering what the difference was between a brain injury and a body injury. After all, is my brain a part of the body? And I decided to try and go down that path to try and answer what is body, what is brain. So the answer to that is given at the end, or my answer to that is given at the end of this presentation. And I'm hoping that you can either understand what I'm saying, why I come to the conclusion that body and brain operate as one. But again, let's walk there slowly. Now, our brain never ever stops working. It just doesn't. From the minute we're born to, well, whenever I give a presentation like this, that's when my brain stops working. So, so I have to kick it into gear again. But the brain, like the heart, never stops working for our entire life. The brain is the operator of the entire body. When we cut our finger, it bleeds. Clotting takes place on that finger. Underneath that clotting, the skin tissue is replaced. A scar is formed. That whole healing process is being operated and orchestrated by the brain. The brain is the boss of the body. We have seen times in the nighttime when we are dreaming that we are being chased by a bear or some other adversary, and we wake up sweating with our heart beating wildly. Now, what caused those body reactions? Our brain believed that we're in a scenario where it had to respond and give our body the necessary utility it needed to escape the danger that we're in. That danger was never there, but our brain did not know that and gave the body the equipment and facility it needed in order to escape whatever it was enduring at that time. The brain, as I said, is the boss of the entire body. When we have hair growth or breathing or heartbeat, now there are shortcuts to the brain so that the brain doesn't have to be actively involved in everything about the body. Our hair can grow, for example, a little bit without the brain. Our breathing can happen almost without the brain. There's many things that can happen without the brain, but it all goes through the brain. The brain, as I said before, operates the entire body. So I'd like to tell you a few details of my stroke. We'll start there. So my stroke happened on December 29th, 2015. I had a hard day at work, and I was working at my desk that evening, and my left hand started to do something strange. It's hard to describe what it was, but I was holding a mouse. I'm a left-handed person, so I was holding the mouse with my left hand. Something appeared very wrong. Because of my stressful day at work, I didn't pay it much mind, and I went to bed, which was a mistake. I woke up the next day and I knew something was very wrong. And I asked my wife to drive me to the hospital. Now, when you go to the hospital with a stroke, you've heard all these stories about how long we have to wait in an emergency room for a doctor to show up to be addressed, et cetera, et cetera. When you go to the hospital with a stroke, there is no waiting. They push you ahead of the line. And why? Because time is of the essence. If they don't catch you in time, you can carry deficits around for a lot longer. So there is no waiting when you go to the hospital emergency room with a stroke. So, but what there is, they put me in this examining room and there was a wait. I had to wait about 15 minutes for a doctor to show up. I was actually surprised that I had to wait that long. The doctor eventually showed up, of course, and in walks this big burly guy. Now, when you go to the hospital tries to determine some things very quickly. One, they try to determine if you are really having a stroke. If you're not having a stroke, well, they go through one thing. But if you're really having a stroke, then they try to determine, is it an ischemic stroke, a hemorrhagic stroke? What type of stroke is it? Because their procedures for handling these things are different for each case, of course. And the last thing they try and determine is, very often strokes occur in clusters. We can sometimes get strokes, many at one time. And so the hospital wants to determine that you're not going to have another stroke on their watch. Good things, they say, come in three. They don't want that to happen, and they want to make sure that you're not going to be engaging in another stroke anytime while you're in the hospital. It's part of their liability. So, but as the thing proceeded, the doctor walks in and he doesn't have any expression on his face. And I'm sitting there wiggling my feet, trying to understand what's happening to me. I understand that I'm in a hospital examining room. My brain is clear enough for me to understand that. But I'm looking at this guy without an expression, and he starts asking me these questions. I mean, these questions that are making no sense to me. First, he asked me, Mr. Mowat, do you know where you are? I think for a while, and I say, well, I'm in the same place that you're in. Why do you ask? He doesn't change his expression. He says, Mr. Mowat, do you know how many kids you have? My wife is sitting right there, so I say, I believe she can answer that just as well as I can. Again, no expression change. And then he asked me, do you know who our current president is? Now, for some reason or other that I'm still not understanding, this question seemed to annoy me, and he can sense that. So he tries to de-escalate things by changing the evaluation technique. He asked me to stick out my tongue. So I'm thinking, now we're going to make funny faces at each other. So I stick out my tongue, and he sticks out his. He says, move your tongue from left to right. And now puff out your cheeks. Move your eyes from left to right without moving your head. Now, here we are making funny faces at each other, and I'm figuring out what the hell is going on here. We're making funny faces. I'm coming in because I wanted to find out what's wrong with me, and here we are making funny faces at each other. So he sees my heightened anxiety coming up again, so he tries to de-escalate things, and he holds up his hands. He says, Mr. Mowat, I want you to push against both my hands simultaneously. Now, I find out later on that he's trying to determine the asymmetry of my strength, but I don't know that at the time. And I'm thinking, this guy wants to test my manhood or something like that. Of course, strength is something I'm known for, and he's going to now test my strength. You know, the thoughts are going crazy up here. So I'm pushing against his hands, and I'm pushing hard and hard. And again, no expression change on this guy. None. So he puts his hands down suddenly, and he says, we're going to send you for an MRI. So after the stupid questions, the stupid faces, and the strength test, I get sent to this room where there's a time capsule in there. They push me into this time capsule, and I'm just hoping that I come out in the same time zone that I went in with. Again, my thoughts are all confused, and I'm playing around with my thoughts in my head, so I don't really know what's going on. After I come out of the time capsule, they said they have found a hospital room for me to stay the night. That's when I understood that I am staying the night. Something must be wrong with me. It was one of the worst nights I've had. I did not have a very sleepful night that night. One, I started to now worry that something was actually wrong with me. I had sensed that something was actually wrong with me, but it was starting to become crystal clear that something was wrong with me, and stroke was a concept in my head that I wasn't quite familiar with at the time, but it had an ugly connotation in my head. So I laid there, and every 2 hours, a nurse came into me all throughout the night and took my vital signs. There was going to be no sleeping that night. Why did they do this, I asked? They wanted to make sure that I was not engaged in another stroke on their watch. Now, at one point, instead of every 2 hours, I think the nurse had a delay and it took about 3 hours. During that time, I started to dream. And I don't remember the dream I had, but she came in, tapped me on the shoulder, and said, "Mr. Mowat, it's time for your vitals." I don't remember my dream, but that is not what I wanted to see in my dream and hear this lady say, "It's time for my vitals." But again, there we go. But I spent 3 days in the hospital, during which time they did all sorts of tests to check out my deficiencies, spatial deficiencies, sequencing tests, if I can pick up objects, all sorts of things just to categorize my deficits. They wanted to see how bad my stroke was affecting me. Now, the most memorable part of this thing was when I was leaving the hospital and the nurse said the following thing to me. He said, "Mr. Mowat, you've just had a stroke. You will have to go through some rehabilitation." And I've seen many stroke patients, and I want to tell you, never, ever give up on yourself, because when you give up on yourself, those people who care for you, whether they say it or not, will also give up on you. So always move yourself ahead. Always move yourself ahead. Never give up on yourself, because you will help those people around you to support you when you do not give up on yourself. I took those words to heart. So coming home, I still had to make sense of my hands. My hands were so confusing to me. I couldn't figure out what they were doing at the end of my arm. Yeah, my fingers, everything. I'm a software engineer, a left-handed software engineer at that. So I tried typing, and this was horrible. My right hand could type fairly fine, but my left hand could not type at all. And this was very, very frustrating to me. It was angering and frustrating. I tried to put in a password that I had been using for 4 years, almost every single day. And it took me a while simply to remember this password, and I could not enter it in. I ended up calling my wife over to help me put in this password. And I felt this frustration and anger growing inside of me. And that's when I knew that I had to take a different course. Before I continue on, I have to tell you that I have meditated for many years now, and have used meditation as a tool for many, many things. And you'll hear me refer to my meditation practices throughout this discussion. So, and here again, once I felt my frustration and anger rise up, I knew that this was not good for me. That if I was going to do anything, that this frustration and anger was going to stand in my way. So I had to do something about this. Meditation was my path to do something about that. I am not advocating that everybody takes up meditation, although I think it's beneficial. Other people may have found other tools. We are all different. But for me, it was meditation. Now, one thing I did was practice and practice and practice. I am an athlete, and I've understood many times the value of practice. I've practiced many things as an athlete and know how the body responds to practice. I now know how the mind responds to practice. It's the same thing. So I practice and I practice and I practice. Let me tell you how I practice. I could not sign my name when I got home from the hospital. There was no sense of my hands. So what I did, I took out a new notebook And over the next week, I must have signed my name close to 4,000 times. My wife watched me do this. She says, "You are crazy." I could not handle my hands properly. So what I did, I threw out a jar of pennies, and first I turned them all over to heads, and then I turned them all over to tails. And then I put them back in the jar. And after I completed that, I threw them all back out on the desk again. For the first week, I must have signed my name about 4,000 times. I must have turned over about 3,000 coins. This was critical for me. And she asked me, "Why are you doing this so manically?" And I just turned to her and said, "The more we do what we cannot do, the better we can do what we cannot do." That statement, you'll hear me say that again, fueled my practice quite heavily. So I didn't realize it at the time, but the practice that I immediately engaged in after I came home from the hospital kicked in neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is triggered by our own rewiring, by our own thoughts, by our own actions. That's how neuroplasticity is triggered. By the way, I'm going to be speaking of neuroplasticity. I have an advantage to understand this whole concept because my daughter recently graduated from Harvard with a neuroscience degree. So she helped me to understand what my mind was being engaged with and everything else. So I don't want to, sound like some scientist. I'm not. My daughter has helped me. But neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to change and grow in response to its own internal and external experiences. Now, I'm going to give you an example of that, but I like to repeat that statement again because there's a lot packed into that statement that I'm going to dissect. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to change and grow, that is, to rewire in response to its own internal and external experiences. When I mentioned before the brain, what the brain does to the body when you're dreaming of being chased, the body's reaction to that is the brain's internal reaction to its own experiences. The brain is experiencing something that's not real. That's the brain's internal experiences. But if you were actually being chased, the brain would do the same thing to your body. Your heart would beat heavier, you'd be sweating. So it doesn't matter whether the experience is an internal experience, like a dream, or an external experience, like actually being chased. Your brain cannot tell the difference and will prepare your body for the perceived danger. In fact, this is the basis for brain-changing meditation and some of the newer cognitive therapies that we've been hearing about, because the brain cannot tell what's real and what's not, what's good or bad. It just follows a pathway that we can control, and we've learned how to control the path of what the brain perceives. So the brain can rewire itself in response to accidents, in response to disabilities, in response to our conscious thoughts. That's important. The brain can rewire itself in response to its own conscious thoughts, to our strong emotions, to learning new skills, to learning anything, meeting new people. This Zoom call that I'm on right now can help reform new pathways, new neural pathways in my brain. And it's not a question of age. The older brain changes almost as well, not quite, but almost as well as the older brain. I am 72 years old, and I trust my brain to rewire itself as it needs to. So now I mentioned how thoughts can control our body. We've all made ourselves, by this time of our lives, we've all made ourselves angry with our own thinking. Now, what does it mean to be angry? Cortisol surges through our body. Cortisol is the fight or flight hormone that we put into our body when we're in danger, or our brain puts into our body when we're in danger through the endocrine systems. So we've all made ourselves angry or in a dream state made ourselves excited and stuff like that. It's the brain that is doing this to us. And this brain effect can be trained so that we can either calm it down or excite it. We can sit in a chair and make ourselves ready for this fight or flight circumstance, or we can calm it down. We can go in either direction. Now, My immediate practice when I came home from the hospital told my brain to get to work to find new neural pathways to establish the things that it has always been able to do and could no longer do at that moment. To find new ways of doing this, to rewire that capability throughout the brain. So again, it was this manic practice that I engaged in. And I watched my wife watch me. She thought I was crazy. What, will you stop signing your name? Will you stop picking up those coins? And I said, no, this is my path to getting these capabilities back again. And again, I kept on telling her, the more we do what we cannot do, the better we can do what we cannot do. Now, I mentioned my athletic pursuits before. Most people practice a skill until they can do it. But athletes, professional musicians, and other professionals practice skills until they can only succeed in doing it, so they cannot fail in doing it. And that is the level of practice that I aspire to. So that is the reason why I signed my name over 4,000 times in that notebook. Picked up coins over 3,000 times. I wanted to get it so that I could not fail to do these things. And this is the attitude that I refer to. I am not any more special than any of you. It is this attitude of persistence that may set me apart, but it is not anything that I have that any of you don't have either. We train ourselves to have this kind of attitude. We can actually train ourselves out of depression. When we are engaged in these sort of recovery periods, many times we find ourselves depressed about things. I myself have encountered that myself, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But to help us understand how the brain can operate on us negatively, I want to give you an example of road rage and how a person comes to behave so poorly in the middle of traffic on the road. So we go into our car for a commute to work, and we see something that we prefer not to see in the road, something that somebody breaks the rules of the road, and we find ourselves annoyed by it. At first, it's a mild annoyance, but the next day, we see other examples of this annoyance. Now, unbeknownst to us, we are rewiring our brain. Every time we think a thought, it becomes easier to think that same thought. So every time I find myself annoyed, it becomes easier to be annoyed at that same thing. Now, I discovered this too late to make up to my wife, of course, but every time we find a happy thought or a sad thought and repeat that, we are actually rewiring our brain. So by the time that we have encountered a dangerous situation on the road, our thought habit is to kick in with anger. This is how we've trained our brain, but we can train our brain in other things as well. I want to talk to you about my depression because I believe there's some, I'm going to mention my depression several times here. One, what it was for me, and two, how I escaped my depression. Every recovery usually involves some sort of depression. Why does this happen to me? What makes me so special that I have to endure this crap? And all the rest of that stuff. So I found myself depressed for about a month, and I knew that this depression was not favorable for my life, my recovery, or my pursuits. I turned to my personal philosophies. As I said, I meditate and I engage in those sort of personal philosophies where I previously trained for so long to develop a sense of who I was and, more importantly, who I was not. I believe that I am the author of my life and that my thoughts, mainly the depressive ones that I was engaged in at that time, was not who I was. That my feelings came from a repetitive thought loop that was going on in my head that had taken hold. As I said, in the same way we grow into road rage, I had grown into a depressive thinking, and I wanted to spot this loop that was causing this depression. So I trained myself to understand what thinking that I was using to feel that I was not worthy of love, not worthy of being healed, not worthy of the good things of life. and how could I, think this about me, and what validity did I have to do that? And I will talk more in a few minutes about how I was able to escape that cage that my thoughts had put myself in. This was important for me, and I've developed a technique that I can use in the future to help me escape these kinds of thinking that will destroy me if I allow it to. So I'm going to speak about meditation a little bit, and I'm not pushing meditation on those of you who do not meditate. Although I have found it a valuable tool, I've been engaged in meditation for over 10 years now, and people respond differently, and not everyone is the same. So those of you who do not meditate, there's nothing here that you cannot grab hold of using some other tool that is favored by you, that resonates with you. But I've used meditation to train my thinking. Our beliefs about ourselves limit or enhance what we can do with ourselves. If I believe that I'm capable of healing, that enhances my ability to heal. If I believe that I'm not capable of healing, that suppresses my ability to heal. I've found that a large part of our daily emotions is a result of habits of thinking that we engage in on a daily basis that form pathways in our mind to help us feel the way we do. Each thought has a feeling associated with us. To feel good, we think good thoughts. To feel bad, we think bad thoughts. And we can train what thoughts we engage in. Contrary to what many people believe, these habits can be changed with neuroplasticity. I will talk about that in a few minutes. But our temperament, we are born with natural temperaments. Some people are born with mean temperaments. Some people are born with angelic temperaments. But all of it is available to be influenced through neuroplasticity. I myself was born with the meanest temperament you could ever imagine. But at this point in time, is at 72 years old, I've been able to conquer most of it. Our emotions form the basis of how we feel. Our emotions can help us, can open us up to the world and make us receive such things as love, gratitude, compassion, laughter, or our emotions can shut us down and we can feel loneliness, depression, sadness, or loss. When I was in my depression, it was the loss, sadness, and fear that I was experiencing. But stepping out of that, I was able to open myself up to the blessings of the world, which are always there. They've never gone away. They've always been there. So, and I've discovered that my depression, and possibly yours as well, is an internal cage that I myself have created. I create my own depression through my thinking that I am not controlling. And I'd like to talk about how I escape this cage that I personally have created for myself and been able to escape from.
Thank you.
It is through the power of our emotions that we shut ourselves down. When we are happy, healing is facilitated. Whether it be brain healing or body healing, healing is enhanced when we're happy. When we're depressed, healing is suppressed. When we're depressed, healing is suppressed. Now, I'd like to give you an example of this that you may be able to relate to. Suppose one day you wake up and you find that you've won the lottery. Most of us would feel absolutely phenomenal that day, right? We've won the lottery. We have all sorts of imaginations of what life forward would be like. And we look at this ticket and we feel great. Now, take that feeling, forget about winning the lottery, but take that feeling, capture that feeling, and imagine the following. Imagine how healthy you would be if you can feel that way every day. Because feeling that way every day is the essence of well-being. Your body starts to work in much better ways. Whether you have diabetes, cancer, whatever, your body starts to work in much better ways when you're happy, when you're feeling good about everything around you. The body starts to respond in much better ways. And to be healthy in that manner, just feel good. But we realize that every single day, after a fashion, we've won the lottery. There's no reason for us not to feel that way. So every single day, we have an ability to enhance our own healing, whether it be brain, body, or whatever have you. So any habit that's formed is formed through repetition. And here is where I would like to talk to you about how I sort of escaped the depression cage that I set for myself. Our emotions are a result of our thinking habits. We can create inside of ourselves a sense of rage or a sense of blessing, a sense of gratitude. All of this comes from our own thoughts. Each thought has its own feeling about it. The more we think a thought and feel its effect on us, the more easily it becomes to think this thought. And this is the key out of my own depression. Now, again, I have to tell you, I am not any different than any of you. I'm not setting myself apart as something special here, but this was my path out of depression. It's 4 steps that I take when I find myself in a place with my thoughts that I prefer not to see, not to be in. 1, I am mindful of what I do not want. In the case of this depression, I saw myself thinking, or some form of it, that I'm not worthy of the healing that I desire. I'm not worthy of the love that I desire, that there's a reason why life's blessings was not coming my way. And I knew that although I could justify those feelings, I could also justify the exact opposite, that whatever was out there, I can justify anything. I am worthy of love, and I can justify why I am. I am worthy of healing, and I can justify why I am just as strongly as I can justify why I'm not. The choice was mine to justify either one. So I was able to take what I wanted to see and justify why I should be, why I should have that. If, it's easy for me to justify why I am worthy of love, as are all of you. It's easy, if I so choose, it'd be easy for me to understand why I'm not worthy of love. They're both equally valid. You choose which camp you want to sit on, but one is so much better for the other. So first I understand what I don't want to feel. That's step 1. Then I understand step 2, what I want to feel, and I validate that, why I'm worthy of love, why I'm worthy of healing. And then I catch myself. Step 3 is to catch myself with a new way of thinking. Once I catch a thought that says I'm not, then I know that I've proven to myself already that I am worthy of love. I am worthy of healing, and that I can justify that thought just as easily as I can justify any negative thought as well. They're both easily justifiable, and I prefer to justify the more positive one. So once I saw me switch my thought, I was crowding out the negative thoughts and overpowering the negative thoughts with the more positive thoughts. Well, again, as we saw earlier, thinking becomes a habit. Thinking one thing and thinking that over and over again becomes a habit. Instead of thinking fear over and over again, or loneliness over and over again, I was now thinking love over and over again, and connection over and over again, and healing over and over again. And lo and behold, it took me less than 3 days to understand that I was stepping out of my depression and to step back into life again. These are the steps that I use whenever I find myself, my thinking in a bad place. And I've used these steps several times to understand where I should be in my life, in my thoughts. If anyone has questions, I am good with questions. I love having questions.
How much of this do you think is because, we tend to think what other people tell us we should think?
Could you repeat that?
How much do you think is caused by the idea of mob mentality, or what people tell you should think, and that's why you think that way?
I think a lot of it is caused by that. The stereotype, I tend to cater to older people, and I listen to the stereotypes that our culture has about older people and how older people have sucked into these stereotypes. like I said before, I am 72 years old, but no one would guess that because of how I act. I act like a kid, okay. but these stereotypes are destroyers for many people. And when we, for example, you've heard the stereotype as stroke survivors, you've heard the stereotype that whatever you do not gain back after a year probably will not come back. This is incorrect. You should not be hearing stuff like that because it's not correct. We can always gain, we can always push forward. And even if the progress is much smaller than what it was in the beginning, it's still progress that is valuable. So, Clem, that's an excellent question. The stereotypes that the culture gives us many of them are not good for us at all. And I deal with that in my business and my podcast because they help older people become old. I make a distinction between older and old, and the stereotypes around us help us to become old instead of just simply older. We all have to become older, but none of us have to become old. And I try and live as an example of that. Neuroplasticity is such that the older brain changes almost just as well as a younger brain. Now, when we're teenagers and young adults, et cetera, our brains are changing fast. We have new experiences all over the world, all over the place. But as older folks, our new experiences are not as strong. You have a question, Nick? Do I see hand raised? Okay. You have to unmute. You have to unmute. You'll have to unmute. You're muted.
I'm having technical problems. I was listening. I have a headache. With my background with neuropsychology and psychiatric med. The thing is, in medicine, things are much more nuanced. Pop psychology and pop medicine tells you everything is binary. It doesn't get better. It doesn't this, or it always does this. Everything is nuanced, very subtle. But the problem is the people who write those books are writing for a big audience that they don't know how much they know about medicine. For example, like after 2 years, you stop recovering. What actually, more precisely, in terms like, for example, that 1,000-page medical book that I have on brain injury medicine, to be more exact, what they're saying is that the recovery from the neurons that you have already, what you're going to get back from the neurons that are still alive, that's it. Done. The neurons that are still living. The next phase will be neuroplasticity after that. We'll be making new connections where neurons that you still have will make those connections and you will grow new pathways. And so you have the neuroplasticity. After that, after about 5 to 10 years, then you finally rely on strategies and techniques and tricks you learn and new ways of learning and thinking. So there's subtlety and nuance in that. And that's part of the problem, is that most of the books you read, the pop books that are easy to read, fast, and, not at a 15th grade level, ones for doctors and, are written simplified. And you don't get that information. It's like, yeah, sure, I could take, this book and say, okay, go ahead and read this monster. This is brain injury medicine for physicians. But that is not what the regular public or what the publishers are going to be having you study and make sense of, because it's just too complicated because you don't have the background.
Yeah, so they dumb it down for us.
Well, actually,
exactly, they cook it down, and you miss a lot of the facts, and that's really the problem. And why, when I hear people talk about this stuff, it's like it's really not accurate because they cut out too much and they don't respect the intelligence of
you're actually saying something that's quite valuable, and you just made a very good point, by the way, about neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity, I may not say this as accurately as I should, but neuroplasticity comes in two forms. One, building new neurons, that's one form, and then building new neural pathways, that's another form. So
you only gain about 18,000 new neurons a year. That's the limit. And that against hundreds of millions, that's a very limited amount. What it is you grow new connections.
Yes,
And then
it's the new connections
benefits.
that are important here, because
Yes.
you can only grow, you're limited with the neurons you can grow, but you're not limited. Well, I shouldn't say you're not limited, but the neural pathways, the new neural pathways that you can form through the brain are much less limited. You have much more agility in your brain to form those new neural pathways. So although you may be limited in forming new neurons or brain cells, you are not limited in forming new pathways through them. And so I refer to both of those mechanisms as neuroplasticity. But again, I still want to emphasize that a thought will tend to groove itself into our brain. An angry thought will groove itself into our brain and we become an angry person. A healthy thought will groove itself into our brain and we become a healthy person. You know, you've heard of things like gratitude journals, because this works to groove gratitude into our personality, into our life. And so, these are important ways of forming new grooves into our brain that help us. Yes, Clem?
Lee, I think that everything you said has been amazing. I really enjoy it. To me, the only thing I would question is, you talked about emotions. Emotions have the power that you assign it. In other words, you decide what's worth something to you. Whether you're going to feel good or bad about it, it's just because the way you feel it. I have tried to talk about this for a lot of times, and in fact, I wrote a book about it. One of the biggest things that I find is people don't know how to define good or bad, good or evil. They can't recognize it. They don't know how to recognize it. So I came out with something that's very simple. Good always leads to more. Evil divides. That's what it does. That's its point.
I like that definition.
It's always less than. And you look at
I would express that a little bit differently, but I like that definition. Good opens you up to something.
Right.
Evil closes you down from something. So
it's always less. It's always less than
it's
you
always
could be.
less. So, but again, my point here is good or evil, the brain doesn't know. It'll form a groove around anything you do here. And you can inadvertently, accidentally fall down paths that you don't want to fall down in terms of your thinking. You can suppress your own healing in this manner. My belief in myself is part of this process. I believe that I can heal. And right. My brain is reinforcing this belief. Our brain tells us who we are, and we can limit ourselves with our own beliefs. And these things form grooves.
What I was talking about was recognizing when your brain is falling into one of those tracks.
Yeah, that's a sneaky, because it creeps up on you.
Right.
When I found myself in depression, I didn't realize, it took me a long time to even use the word depression, because it's not something I would normally associate with myself. But once I did, how to address it opened up to me. So, but before I said the word depression to myself, I was walking around feeling uncomfortable, not right, not the way Lee wants to feel, and so, and things were not working right in my body. I was waking up with a stomach ache, et cetera, and I realized that my thoughts, my depression was taking a hold of me. Like I said, a depression is an internally created cage that we put around ourselves. At least I put around myself. So
that's what I think everybody does. And
well, I don't want to say everybody, because people are different.
Right. Right. But when everybody feels uncomfortable or different within themselves.
That's
and
right.
when you do feel different, all I suggest is you take a look at the thoughts that you're having and look at them.
That's right.
Do they lead to more, or do they divide?
Now, we are told that every stroke is different. And this is true. I am not debating that at all. There's no one stroke that is the same as any other stroke. But I have found something that is common to every stroke survivor, and I want to put it to all of you. This is a common element for everyone who's ever had a stroke, and here it goes. When you give up on yourself, improvement stops. That is common for every stroke survivor. Giving up on yourself, no matter what type of stroke you had. My stroke was an ischemic stroke. If you give up on yourself, every improvement you want to make stops. That is common, no matter how mild, how severe, whatever it is. That is common for everybody. That is the one thing that we all have in common.
That's true for every person.
Yes.
No matter whether they have a stroke or not.
This is definitely true. Thank you. Thank you. You recognize the broader application here. But again, I am not calling myself a special person. There's no one here who doesn't have everything that I've had to do whatever I've done, with myself. So, I don't have any special intelligences. I don't have a special genetics. I am an identical twin, by the way. So, but
I thought I'd seen you before.
but still, I don't have anything special that any of you don't have either. An attitude, the only thing I claim that I have that's special is I have a special attitude about myself. I believe that I am the author of everything I think, and that those thoughts have an effect on me. So I allow myself, there's things I don't allow myself to say, and there are things I promote myself to say. I believe my words have power inside of me, and that power has been used to heal so much of what I have. So I don't want to, make myself stand up as special or anything else like that. But I have discovered what is common for every stroke survivor. That is, when you give up on yourself, it all stops. It all stops. So I'm here to tell you that never give, no matter how old you are, neuroplasticity is still a fact. And thank you for the scientist there, McFlat, I think the name is, that corrected me and divided neuroplasticity into the two parts. One, the creation of new brain cells, neurons, and the formation of new pathways. That was a valuable correction, and I will incorporate that in my thinking going forward. So I appreciate that. See, I can learn too. Yeah. So, but again, I encourage everyone to feel themselves, feel their own heart, feel their own happiness, feel their own ability to heal, and do not take it away. Do not subject yourself to your own negative thoughts. Many of us are older individuals. Yes, Chrissy.
So I find that a lot of people kind of limit, they try so hard in the very beginning. They try and try and try, and they don't know how to try any harder, but they're not quite to where they want to be. And all of a sudden they start going back down. Not everybody is the same. So what would you tell somebody? Yeah, no, don't give up. Yeah, well, yeah, easy to say.
You're making a good point. This is what I call the recovery plateau. I call this point because when we first try to gain any skill, we can see its improvements. I saw grand improvements the first week or two I was at the hospital, but then I was practicing manically in ways that no one would ever realize I was. But still,
that also works for the emotional part too, not just the physical. I'm talking about the emotions.
That's right, because
positivity to keep going.
Well, that was one of the things that my wife was amazed at. She couldn't believe how much I was pushing forward, doing just signing my name, lifting coins up. She couldn't believe the emotions I was using. And whenever I get frustrated, I take a break, 5-minute break, listen to some loud music, meditate a little bit, and then go right back at it to calm my emotions, because practicing that way can become very emotional, especially when you're not seeing what you're seeing. So Chrissy, we reach a recovery plateau where we improve a lot at first, and then we start to level off in this plateau. And that's athletes encounter this plateau as well. A lot of my understanding is from being an athlete. Again, I have to emphasize, even if I do meditation and you guys do not, there is no problem with that. I have found my way through my own peace inside, and each one has to find their own way. And I cannot criticize someone who does not use my way. That is not the goal here. You all have to find your ways that resonate with you. But I can assure you, I have nothing special that any of you do not have.